This is our countdown, our non-official countdown. Hello everybody, welcome back to the new episode of Sparking Connections. It is
Hello.
Science Today. I guess we can just get straight into it unless there's any other announcements that need to be made.
Nope, get straight into it, I say.
All right. So today we're talking about the truth behind GMOs.
How dramatic.
Ooh, not really. So, do you know what a GMO is, first and foremost?
Genetically modified organism, I would
Yes,
assume?
organism. I was worried you were going to just stop then. But yes, genetically modified organism. And obviously, again, another controversial topic.
Ooh, love those.
I do. Controversy is where I'm at all the time.
You're just argumentative.
I mean, if you're good at it, why stop? So, to start off with, what is a GMO? So we say genetically modified organism. So organism, easy, living thing. And that can be any living thing, from the little tiny bacteriophage all the way up to the most giant dinosaur. Yes, dinosaurs. So
Nice.
it's organisms that you mix their genes, kind of. So we are clear on what genes are. They're the code that makes up our everything. They help. They're the instruction manual for the things that create everything that we are. So genes can be for your hair color, your eye color, how tall you are, and genes can also be for things like how resistant to antibiotics bacteria are, or how well you grow in a certain soil type, because obviously we all grow in different soil types. So it's basically the very root of what makes you, you, and what makes any other organism an organism. So usually GMOs are something that are generated in the lab, because you can't typically insert a gene into something without a lab. And that's the key thing about GMOs, is that you need to insert a gene from something completely different to what the original organism is. So say you're trying to insert a plant gene into a bacteria. I don't know why you would. It'd typically be the other way around. But for argument's sake, we're trying to put a plant gene into a bacteria. You're not going to be able to just put those two things next to each other and go, make a thing. So it has to be done in a lab, usually with along the lines of transgenics. Again, trans genes, kind of self-explanatory. And you actually see this naturally happening between, I guess, I'll put this to you. I'll explain what crossbreeding is, and then I'll explain what bacteria do. And we can have a discussion about whether it's the same thing or not. So crossbreeding is when you have, for example, a plant, and it makes lovely grapes. I hate grapes, but it makes lovely grapes. And then you have another plant that makes different flavored grapes. And you found out that when you mix those two flavors together, they taste like cotton candy. So you breed those two plants and they make cotton candy grapes. Because they're both plants of the same species, it's crossbreeding, not genetic modification. But technically is genetic modification. Me and Chi-Chi have talked about this a lot, because I think it's genetic modification, because you are pressuring the genes to be altered, but it can be done naturally, quote unquote. So swapping of genes between two of the same species, or yeah, I'd say two of the same species, because typically you can't make fruiting, or the plants would be infertile if they were not the same species. You can't breed like you can't breed, have a fertile organism from like a horse and a donkey, for example. Is that a mule, but the mule's infertile?
I think so, yeah.
Something like that. So basically, what defines a species as a species is that you can make fertile offspring when breeding the two together. So, crossbreeding, got that in your mind?
Mm-hmm.
GMO, got that in your mind? So, bacteria do this natural process called conjugation, where they form. So, you know what bacteria looks like? I'll give everyone a brief description. It's got a cell wall and insides and various little, what would you call them? Structures on the outside, little bits that jut out. Basically, it makes them aware of their surroundings. And what can happen is a bacteria can be aware of its neighbouring bacteria and form a little pili. A little tube will start to project from its outside, and it will go over to the neighbouring bacteria and fuse with that bacteria. And genetic information inside the bacteria, obviously it's not a nucleus because bacteria do not have nuclei. They have either circular DNA or strands of DNA, and that's replicated and then sent along the tube to the neighbouring bacteria. And that's typically done with bacteria that have antibiotic resistance genes, because they're like, if I pass on this resistance gene, more of my kin will be able to survive. So, conjugation, moving of a gene from one species to another. I put it under GMO, but it's not, it's the same species. But bacteria can conjugate with bacteria not of their same species. What would you say that is? It's not crossbreeding necessarily. It's not GMO, like transgenics necessarily, but it is still a form of transgenics. And I wondered what your thought was on that.
I mean, I don't know about technical terms, haven't a clue, but genetically modified organism. You are modifying the genetics. Surely that could apply to anything, regardless of whether it's people doing it in a lab or a natural process.
Right, that's where my head would be at.
There's a difference between genetically modified and like artificially genetically modified, if we want to be more specific. But yeah, this is bacteria modifying their own genetics, which is odd. I did not know that that was a thing that could happen.
I mean, yeah, they just share genes that could be useful to others. So yeah, it's kind of not necessarily crossbreeding because they're not making a new organism, but it's also not, I don't know, me and Chi argue about this. She always says that crossbreeding is not the same as genetic modification because, I don't know, we've talked about it, and I think that it's all the same thing, but a lot of, because then I get annoyed when people are like, GMO is so wrong, and I'm like, you're also eating grapes that taste like mangoes. What are you doing? Like, that is technically genetic modification. So we've had forms of genetic modification for ever, almost. In history, one of the first things to be genetically modified, quote unquote, are domestic dogs. You know, you breed two dogs together and you get a Shih Tzu. Wow, dogs. But before that, artificial selection of wolves. You choose the wolves that are a bit more docile, a bit more domesticatable. Is that a word? Wolves that you can domesticate more easily than typical wild wolves. And over time, we had doggos, which is great because we love doggos.
Love doggos.
And then there's also the things of artificially selected crops. You know, you breed two crops together, you make a better crop. Or for manufacturing various medicines, you breed two things together and you extract the thing that you want it to make. You know, there's going to be instances everyone's experienced or heard of crossbreeding and therefore genetic modification. It's only
it is so strange.
Yeah, go ahead.
It is so strange to me that it took until the Victorian era for somebody to put forward the theory of evolution. Considering or to put forward the theory of natural selection, considering we had artificial selection for thousands of years.
Yes.
Like, all that Darwin was saying, basically, was, you know, that thing you've been doing with animals, where you breed some animals together and you get a different kind of animal. It's that, but happening naturally, slowly. Like, it's the same thing.
Right.
And everyone was like, what? No. I mean, I know there's historical stuff, but like, we were doing it. When
you put those two cows together because they produce the best milk and were like, I want even better milk, you knew way deep down, that you were doing genetic modification. You just didn't realize it yet. But yeah, that's true. Like, how did it take so long to realize when you bred two things together and you produce a thing with a mix of both, it wasn't genetics, you know? But in any case, we do it for food, we do it for medicines, we do it for animals, we do it for everything. We do it for ourselves. No. Well, actually, let's talk about that. Do you think that we do genetic modification for ourselves?
That's eugenics.
When we breed with each other. But even so, you think not necessarily you're looking for the best of the most elite, but you're attracted to someone funny, right? And you want to have children with that person. I mean, unrelatable content, but here we are. Do you not then hope that your child would inherit characteristics from that person?
Do people think about that consciously? I'm not the best person to ask.
I don't talk about I don't want children. We don't.
Neither of us
children.
Want children.
A question for the listeners then. When you're looking for a sexual partner to have children with, is that something you think about? Is that something you look for? Like, besides the fact that you want someone funny, do you think that then your child is going to have traits that your partner has?
It could well be something that happens subconsciously.
Evolution.
You know, for evolutionary reasons.
Yes, that's true. That is a good point. Yeah, like how people who are tall or people who have like very muscular physiques or people who are very strong or people who look very healthy are attractive to certain people.
But then it's also culturally determined.
Yeah, true. So, but either way, I'm not talking about wiping out a group of people that don't look like you.
That's where it goes.
Yeah,
if you're not careful with it, that's where genetically modified. As soon as you start saying these genetics are good and these ones are bad, that turns into Nazi shit.
Yeah, it does. Well, it turns into literally any kind of white supremacy, any kind of like colonizer behavior in terms of what the white Western aesthetic is. Yeah. So
I am very wary of genetically modifying human beings. You can do what you like with plants, but humans,
that's what I was going to say. Do you think that the reason people disagree with genetically modified organisms for food and plants, because it is some people are very up in arms about it, do you think it's because they have that sort of eugenics mind frame of like, this is what could happen, or do you think it's something else?
Honestly, no, because some of the same people who are so up in arms against genetically modified food are also the people who want to naturally make the human race better, you know?
Right.
This is a Venn diagram, and you are 100% able to be on one side of the Venn diagram and not the other. Like, this Venn diagram is not a circle.
Right.
But when you're online and you find people talking about one, there's like, in my experience at least, there is a reasonable chance that they will also be, at least on some level, interested in the other. It's that sort of like, yes, evolutionarily we should be healthy people should be breeding, and like that sort of like, we're going to naturally get rid of Down syndrome or autism or whatever they've decided to focus on that day. And they're the same people who are like, you know, I think it's the same, it's that logic that unhealthy people are evolutionarily like, they're just destined to die out and we're keeping them alive artificially. And it's the same mindset that's then like, well, if these plants are like this naturally, they should stay that way. Like it's it's the nature thing. People are so obsessed with the purity of nature, and so it kind of goes in opposite directions with people versus plants.
Yeah, because you then couldn't say, oh, but it's okay to modify plants to make them better, but you can't modify humans to make them better, because that's a bit more dodgy. I would say that the kind of, I feel like we keep talking about this, but the ableist mindset of like sick people shouldn't have children and things like that is very obvious in this topic too, in terms of like breeding out certain things and breeding in certain things.
Yeah, because that's genetically modifying, or at least it's artificial selection with animals, and we can breed out traits with animals and with plants, but you can't do that with people.
Please don't do that with people. But I think there is a difference between not wanting children that will experience the same thing as you, and breeding out, in quotation marks, problematic traits. And I use that problematic traits is how it's viewed by people who think that illness or chronic illness or any kind of genetic differences are not good.
There's a big difference between deciding for yourself that you don't want to have children because you don't want to pass something on,
right,
versus it being decided by an external source.
Yeah. Or what you're like fed to believe, or what society sees as the sort of the best person.
Yeah, you have no right to tell somebody else you shouldn't have children because your genetics are bad.
Right,
or inferior.
Exactly. So genetic modification then obviously is a very loaded subject. And the UK has guidelines on what defines like appropriate genetic modification. So the European Food Safety Authority says that it cannot be an allergen, so it can't cause allergies in people.
That's fair.
You're breeding something new and it's going to become allergenic to people, probably not worthy of being sold to people, because it's got a greater health impact. The nutritional value is taken into account. Is it actually adding anything to people's diets and people's ways of life, or is it just you just modified a crop and now you want to sell it? And also, most importantly, is it toxic? Do you want people to eat it? Because sometimes you can make something and you're like, yeah, I'm going to cross this very yummy corn with this very pest-resistant corn, and you put them together and suddenly they produce something that when humans eat them, it makes them very ill. So, yeah, you need to make sure that any kind of crossbreeding or GMO, GM reactions are fully tested, fully researched, and people are fully aware of what is going to be the consequence of consuming this item. And then the only other thing is it has to be labelled as GM. I don't think I've ever really taken note of GM on a label.
Me neither.
Interesting. But then also we're not very concerned with GM food and things.
No.
Like we're not gonna put something back just because it's genetically modified. So this can include, in the UK, this can include foods which are produced with the help of GM technology not being labelled. So if GM technology kind of assisted, I don't know what necessarily this assistance would be, but you don't have to label it if it's just assisted by GM technology. And you also don't have to label meat, milk, or eggs from animals that are fed on genetically modified animal feed. And I think that's quite good, because you want to make sure your animals are eating as nutritious food as possible in the most convenient way, right?
Yes.
But then as soon as you say, we talked about, as soon as you say something's genetically modified or consumed genetically modified food, people are like, what? But no, it just makes things more efficient, more cost effective, more suitable for a commercial environment.
Yeah.
Which is a whole other argument, commercial environments. But either way, you will not know if your animal, egg or milk producer will have eaten GM animal feed. Because they've deemed it's not necessary for you to know that, because you're not going to be impacted by that. You probably eat GM animal fed chicken eggs all the time. It's just the way it goes. And again, you know, are we classing GM as just lab modified, or are we classing it as crossbreeding? Because then certain foods will be crossbred with like certain crops will be crossbred to be, you know, bulkier, more fruitful, and then fed to animals, you know.
What do the guidelines say? Do they say that crossbreeding is okay?
Yeah, it doesn't really specify either way. It still says, you know, when things are bred together, potentially could be genetically modified, but they mostly focus on, for the guidelines, it's mostly focusing on things coming from outside of the UK.
Right, yeah.
Because the UK does do some commercial production of crops and things, but not as much as a lot of other countries. It's not as much of an impact. It's more to do with what we're feeding animals that then, you know, we eat. We're a lot more into like eggs and meat and stuff like that, and milk. So so I've got a little explanation here for the actual difference between crossbreeding and GMO, just to clarify the ways in which GMO might be construed. So I have a feeling that the guidelines are definitely to do with genetic modification from the lab only.
Okay.
But crossbreeding could potentially still be under the umbrella of GMO. So this is also from the European Food Safety Authority. It says the goal of both GM and conventional plant breeding is to produce crops with improved characteristics by changing their genetic makeup. GM achieves this by adding a gene or genes to the genome of a crop plant, sexually compatible plants versus adding DNA from any organism to another kind of organism. So they basically said what the difference is between the two, but they didn't say that one or the other wasn't genetic modification, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So they note that they're two different things, but they didn't necessarily say that crossbreeding wasn't genetic modification. It says that it basically points out that conventional breeding just takes a longer time, and in genetic modification, when you have something that's pest resistant and you mix its DNA with something that isn't pest resistant and typically, you know, produces the product that you want, it just means that you're ending up with the same result as if you bred them together in a more conventional setting. Again, I wouldn't say that GM is much faster, because you have to determine what gene you want, you have to work out how you're going to put it in, how you're going to make sure it goes in without causing damage to the rest of the plant, and then whether it has any unintended effects. Crossbreeding is a lot more trial and error in terms of you breed two things together, does it work? And then you're like, no. And then you breed two different things together, does it work? No. And then you're like, oh, you breed two things together, but if you breed the two requisites of those things, then that might work. So it's more of a physical process, a hands-on process. Okay, so foods that are considered genetically modified that we may have heard of are soybeans, rice, maize, corn, and papaya. I hadn't realised papaya was considered a genetically modified organism. And I think, I don't know if this will record properly, but we will see. But But there's also a paper that I will put in the references that has an interesting table about approved commercial products that are genetically modified and then products that are being developed.
Mm-hmm.
And as you might be able to tell, the things that I've listed, soybean, corn, rice, maize, that kind of stuff, has various things that people want to improve about it to make it better, more easy to grow. There's resistance to herbicides. So basically when you spray herbicide, so poisons that kill herbs or weeds, you want to spray a herbicide that might have been toxic to the original plant, but with this resistance gene to the herbicide, you can spray and it will only kill the weeds.
Fair enough.
And we'll get on to maybe some of the problems and the benefits of that in a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Insect resistance is also something that people kind of want. They don't want, again, spraying for pests. You don't really want to have to spray for pests. You want the plant to do it itself, to protect itself.
Yeah.
And then there's also various sort of enrichments that you can try and cultivate. So making sort of oils or plants or fruits or vegetables more nutritious. Canola oil, the canola that's used to make canola oil is altered so that it has a greater fatty acid composition. So it's more of a, I guess, a better oil, because canola is easy to produce. So they want it to be more efficient at producing the oil, even though it's already a good source of the oil, if that makes sense. They're just trying to amp it up for commercial use. And then you can also use various plants for the production of vaccines. So injection of, sounds a bit dodgy, the injection of some of these products that we use can lead to immune responses. So for example, tobacco, when injected into mice, causes an immune response, which means that scientists think maybe that it could be used to develop a vaccine for something. It hasn't specified what vaccine. Presumably it's trade secret. But yeah, there's a possibility that the tobacco can be. So I think what they do is they insert a antigen, so a little bit of reactive material from the virus into the plant. And then the plant produces the antigen, I assume. And then when that plant, and then obviously it's not the antigen from the virus, so there's no virus involved. So all those people that say that you don't want a live virus in your body or a part of a virus in your body, you won't have to. You can have a piece of plant injected into your body instead.
Fair enough.
And then there's also salmon. There was actually a very interesting case of genetic modification in salmon that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But these salmon are developed to grow faster so that the salmon fishing seasons can occur, or the harvesting seasons can occur more regularly. So you can breed salmon, they'll grow up quicker. You can harvest them because they're like bigger and meatier than, you know, they would be at their natural time in the year. And that means you can, you know, have more salmon more regularly. And there's an interesting discussion related to that, which we can have as well. So obviously the reason we're here is to talk about the impact of genetically modified food, animals, anything on population and planet. So obviously the impact on the planet could link to the impact on the population, but you know, we want to see how those two mix together. So I've got some bullet points written down. I feel like we can just discuss. It's kind of like, do you remember in science when they would be like, and now we're going to do the pros and cons of renewable energy?
Yeah.
This is kind of like that. So I'll have some like points for discussion, and we can discuss like who it impacts and whether it's good or bad. So
okay.
The first bullet point I have is better quality food. What do you think about that?
I mean, clearly a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Could potentially lead to sort of other issues like, to do with selling. Is it going to then end up being more expensive because it's better quality? And will it then outcompete the cheaper stuff? And, will you end up with food prices going up? All those sorts of other issues from it. But in and of itself, if you can make the food, more nutritious and I mean, if you can make it taste nicer, sure, great. All these sorts of things sound like a good thing to me.
Yeah, better quality food means that you're able to introduce vitamins and minerals into people's diets that they might not necessarily be able to have access to. So we can definitely, improve people's health, basically. I guess one argument could be that with food that is more enriched and nutritious, people might not realize its implications in terms of like portion control and like other health benefits in terms of like eating too much or not enough. Maybe you think it's better for you, so you wouldn't eat as much of it, but then you're ending up not really nourishing your body enough.
Or alternatively, eating far too much because it's slightly,
that's what you're used to. Sorry, we're going to have to pause for the internet to come back. There we go. We're back.
Did you hear any of what I said? Because
I did not.
You want to be careful with things like the way that we talk about specific fruits like blueberries, and we say, oh, they're superfoods, and so people just eat. Like, you can't introduce something and say, look at my genetically modified super healthy superfood, without being aware that people might then kind of say, right, cool, I'll eat that and nothing else, or not consider like the rest of their diet because they're like, well, I've got this magic food that's healthy.
Yeah, totally. And then obviously there's the risk of you're used to eating a certain portion of food that has, you know what its nutritional value is, and then suddenly you're eating the same portion of food but it could be more, it could have more protein in it could have more this or more that, and that could have other health implications. I mean, not just unintended weight gain or anything like that, but also, some people's bodies can't handle more protein, some people's bodies can't handle more fats, so it can maybe be surprising to someone that had once eaten a whole bowl of rice but now they can't because it's got, there's unintended or not necessarily noticed impacts. Okay, so the next one is more ethical farming of silks and commercial proteins.
I can't see any downsides with that. That sounds like an overall good thing.
Yeah, definitely. So obviously silk and silkworm harvesting and spider silk harvesting is brutal on the actual animals, because I think for silkworms they allow the silkworm to make a cocoon and then they boil them alive.
Oh, gross. No, that sounds horrible.
They like cultivate silkworms and they make sure they're fed and then they form a cocoon and then they just dump them all and boil them and extract the silk. Which is quite disgusting, actually, and not very ethical, one might say. So maybe producing plants that could produce the silk themselves, or a different method, another animal to produce that silk. I don't know what animal could produce a silk, but for example, some I think they did try and get animals that produced milk to produce antibiotics in their milk and that they could extract.
Okay.
So, I don't know if that's fact. And I'll have to see if there's a...
Just because someone tried doesn't mean they succeeded.
Yeah,
but...
I wanted to... Yeah, exactly. But there was that discussion. Okay, so easier to grow food, also in large amounts.
I mean, again, overall sounds good, except, well, if it's easier to grow in large amounts, then there's a lot of other things you're going to have to bear in mind about, like, there's the temptation to just cut down huge amounts of rainforest so that you can grow all of this really easy to grow food, or have people working harder to produce more and more of it without paying them more because you're genetically modifying it so it's easier. Those sorts of issues. But again, it's like with the better quality food. In and of itself, it's a good thing, but any good thing can be misused by people.
Yeah, particularly
especially
in the commercial
when profits,
sense.
Yeah.
So, yeah, easier to grow means that it's going to potentially grow more quickly or grow with less input. So, you don't need to water it as much. It's drought resistant, or maybe you don't need to put it in a specific type of soil, so you can plant it anywhere. But like you say, if you can plant something anywhere, that means you can clear out large swathes of land that, people feel like aren't contributing anything. But guess what?
And if it can go anywhere, then there's the risk of it becoming an invasive species somewhere.
That actually leads nicely on to my next point. How it impacts the natural environment. So like you say, some plants might, it's herbicide resistant. How are you going to stop it from growing outside of its borders if you can't kill it with herbicides? So it becomes, if it's flowering and seeding and spreading its seeds, those seeds can drift all over the place. And if you can't kill it with herbicide, then, it might grow out of control somewhere else. What kind of impact will that have on the planet, on the environment?
Yeah, like the way that sort of currently in the UK, like red squirrels were the like native species, and grey squirrels, I'm not sure how they got here. I don't know whether that was human intervention
boats. I think it was on
probably
like rats.
But, so now red squirrels are endangered because the grey squirrels came and ate all of their food and generally made basically outcompeted them for resources. And I presume it works the same way with plants. And so you'd have just far too many of a specific plant that takes up all of the nutrients that other plants need, and then those plants go extinct, and you're just messing up the balance. Everything's out of balance.
Exactly. Yeah, the balance too, in particular, ecological balance is so important, because it's, you may be growing crops in a field and they just do their own thing and they can survive, but they might not be suitable for consumption by other animals, or other animals might not know that they're consumable. They might, we make things pest resistant. How far do those pests go? It's not just insects. Is it also mammals or small animals that could maybe be impacted by the consumption of these crops? And if they're out competing natural plants, then what are these animals going to eat? And then they're going to move elsewhere, and maybe they're going to infiltrate urban areas, or maybe they're going to, it becomes more of like a broader ecological problem.
Yeah. The other problem with, like, the other way it might impact the natural environment is that, because you were talking about herbicides and pesticides, because there's a lot of problems with both of those things, with spraying various chemicals on crops. that has problems for people living nearby. It has problems.
The food.
Yeah, there's all kinds of issues. And if we are genetically modifying plants in a way that makes the use of those things easier, we're getting rid of any incentive to find alternatives to those. Because there are, like, people have, it's I don't know very much about this, but apparently there were older methods of farming that, you know, planting different types of crops next to each other, stuff like that, that decreased the likelihood that pests would cause problems for those crops, for example. And we don't do that because it's less efficient, but then we have to compensate by using pesticides and herbicides.
Right.
And actually it would be a lot better if we went back to those older methods or found other methods that don't rely on those chemicals. And so if we're genetically modifying plants to make it easier to use those chemicals, we're more likely to keep using them, and then they'll keep doing damage to the environment and to people and animals nearby.
Yeah, totally. But then I also think that having crops that are resistant to pests and insecticides and like other herbicides and things means that, you know, if a plant is resistant to, you can breed plants that are resistant to pests. So that means you wouldn't need to spray pesticides, because then the plants protect themselves. Yeah,
that's fair. That's
so
it as well.
There's also that impact on the natural environment, is that, you know, the insects just won't eat those plants. And but maybe then, you know, we're back to the, if you cut down large bits of land and replace it with crops that can't be eaten by the natural inhabitants, then you're taking away a whole ecological niche. So but
it's a tool like any other. It's got to be used sensibly.
Yeah, exactly. And also a lot of people are worried about crossbreeding with natural plants and that impact, you know, like hybridizing, crossbreeding of natural plants and crops, which mean that, you know, then wildflowers would be pest resistant, which means that they would grow out of control because there's no pests keeping their natural population down, or, you know, that kind of impact. But you
might not have enough of something like, I don't know, bees or something that we really, really need. I mean, really, every animal and every plant and every, like, bug is a part of the ecosystem that is necessary, even if we don't like it. So if you're, like, it sounds really convenient to say that this plant is pest resistant, but those pests get rid of the, you know, if they can't eat and they die out, then you've got a gap in the system that will be filled some other way, and, you know, in ways that we can't predict.
Yeah, definitely. You know, there's sort of higher order organisms that will eat those insects and pests.
Exactly.
And, but a lot of people are concerned about crossbreeding with natural plants. It's actually very low risk. So there's not actually a huge chance of that happening, just because it's not like what I said about conjugation with bacteria. Just because it's a plant doesn't mean that it's gonna crossbreed with another plant. So yeah, the impact of that is actually surprisingly low. And as I mentioned before, the salmon. So let's think about the principles of natural selection. If you're bigger, stronger, faster, better equipped, you know, like better equipped to live in your environment, you're going to survive, and you're going to, evolutionarily speaking, particularly in animals, other animals are going to want to breed with you. So there was an instance of salmon being enhanced in a way that made them grow faster, mature quicker, be able to produce offspring quicker, that kind of stuff.
Right.
And they outcompeted the natural salmon. So we produced this organism. So it's a bit similar to the squirrel sort of story, but we produced this organism, this salmon. And what you do is you keep them in like little nets so they don't come out into the natural environment. But as with all things that we do in the name of science, mistakes were made and salmon got out, and they were in the natural environment. doing their thing, out competing the other salmon and getting big and juicy, and we can eat them. I mean, I don't like salmon, but we couldn't eat them because they were swimming around and living in their natural environment and messing with the ecosystem. And fortunately, not for the salmon, they didn't breed well. The issue, you would maybe think that's a good thing, because then they didn't continue to produce hyper powerful salmon. But you know, if it was a natural salmon and a modified salmon and they bred, that natural salmon is thinking that it's going to get fertilized eggs and it's going to lay, you know, it's going to continue on its generation. And once they've bred, that's it, they're done, they leave, they've laid their eggs. Those natural salmon then didn't pass on their genetics and produce more natural salmon, because the genetically modified salmon, who were either not very fertile or infertile, didn't fertilize eggs. They didn't allow fertile eggs to be produced. And so not only did the genetically modified salmon die out, but the natural salmon also were severely impacted, because they thought that they were reproducing, and you know, it just didn't work. It was impacted by these infertile modified salmon. So that is also a risk in terms of animals, and particularly animals that you might not necessarily be able to put in a pen. So we've already talked a little bit about the production of new allergens. You know, we don't want allergens to be produced because there's a risk that someone will react badly to it and not be able to eat that food anymore. This one's a bit more broad, but people's perceptions and improved aesthetics. What kind of impact would that have?
I mean, a lot of people perceive genetically modified food as scary and unnatural, and, you know, as if non-genetically modified plants are like, as if non-GMO methods of producing food are natural. Like, yeah,
or not scary.
Well, we've been messing with nature for thousands of years. That's, you know, in more or less sensible ways. But anyway, people perceive it as scary and dangerous. And, you know, I'm not sure precisely, like, if we reached a point where, like, all of our food was genetically modified, people wouldn't exactly have a choice not to eat it.
Right.
But it is something that sort of the agricultural industry would have to contend with, is people's distrust. Aesthetics, it's hard to say. Although I suppose there's already this sort of a lot of food doesn't get eaten or gets thrown away without being sold, because people pick up, you look at something and go, oh, it's a little bit bruised, and so you don't want it, and then, you know, and a lot of food is thrown away before it even reaches supermarkets because it's a little bit imperfect. You know, it doesn't look as nice,
or it doesn't look like its other brethren.
It just looks different, and that's, you know, people don't want to buy it. Which I suppose if you're genetically modifying, I don't know, apples to make them more red, then no one's going to want our threshold for what we consider good enough is going to get higher and higher, and there's going to be more and more food waste.
Yeah. I would say that you, especially for the aesthetic stuff, you've definitely like hit the nail on the head. If we improve food and don't get the idea out of our head that what looks the best is the best, then it will definitely become a huge problem, because, you know, natural carrots are sometimes purple.
Yeah.
So we've crossbred carrots to be orange. So if we bred something to the point where, you know, we can't ever go back to purple carrots now, because everybody in their head thinks a carrot is orange. So improving the aesthetic of something, although it's good because, with genetic modification, it might be you improve the appearance of bananas so that they all appear the same. It's like then there'll be less food waste because you're producing more things that are aesthetically the same. And we've gone again.
You froze. I didn't hear any of that.
That's okay. I saw you'd stopped moving, so I was like, okay. So improving the aesthetic might mean that there'd be less food waste because if you're modifying something and making it so more of the things look the same, so say you're modifying bananas to be the same curve. I don't know whether that is actually a thing you could do, but for the sake of it. So then you would have less bananas that were like deformed or different.
Yeah.
And more bananas that are what we would consider aesthetically pleasing. So it could reduce waste.
Yeah, but it depends what percentage of food in the supermarket is this new and improved beautified banana versus average bananas, because then everyone's just gonna get the more perfect looking ones.
Exactly. So it would only, the improved aesthetic part would only have the best impact if all of the crops were genetically modified to look the same.
Exactly, yeah.
And then obviously people's perception, like you say, a lot of people aren't interested in, or like I say aren't interested, are put off by genetically modified organisms. That plays a huge impact on whether GMs are accepted or not. And people's perception could be the breaking point between having enriched food and having food that isn't enriched, and therefore people aren't getting the right nutrients. So people's perception, obviously we're the people consuming it, so our perception of it is really, really important.
Yeah.
And trying to reduce the stigma around GM is, really important, because you don't want to compromise your health and the food that you could have access to because you're worried that the genetically modified food is going to do something to you.
Yeah, especially if you've set up society in a way that assumes that everybody is eating genetically modified food, because if you then have a subset of people who aren't, and their diet is markedly different from everybody else's, say the way that we talk about nutrition in schools, for example, assumes that we all have access to the same foods.
Yeah, it assumes we have the money to buy the same foods and the ability to cook those foods. Some people just don't know how to cook a plantain or anything. So it might be that changing the perception could be a good thing, but it could also mean that it might not be any impact at all. In America, there's foods called heirloom foods, which are basically the originals of the genetic original of the thing that you're used to consuming. And Esmé is gone again. Hello?
You froze halfway through the word heirloom.
Oh, great. And I don't even know if it... Oh, no, we're still recording. Let me show my screen again then.
You were about to tell me what heirloom foods were.
Yes, I was. Okay, let me go back. So, in the States, there are a lot of people who would like to eat heirloom foods, which are basically the original food of something that is now modified to be more nutritious.
Okay.
So like rice and grains, you can get heirloom rice, which apparently tastes better because it's the original. it's the first form before any crossbreeding happened. It's one of the original forms of rice. And there's people who make business out of growing heirloom foods. And obviously that's a very privileged thing to be able to buy. You know, rice that is not enriched or altered in any way and is the original. It's, you know, small bags for extortionate prices.
It's also a bit weird.
Why? Like, why would you want to eat something that's not as nutritious for you?
Yeah, like as a curiosity, sure. And if it was like the idea when people talk about ancient grains and all these sorts of ideas, and it's like you know, I'm curious about the way the food was produced hundreds of years ago.
Yeah.
And you know, I'm interested to know how food tasted 100 years ago, those sorts of questions. But as a historical curiosity, these sorts of GMO foods have not been around long enough for you to care about it in that respect. It's just this fear of anything that's been changed in any way.
And that's the thing, this fixation on what is natural.
Yeah.
Like, most things that you eat aren't natural, especially meat. So yeah, it's that, but that is a thing as well. So yeah, people's perception definitely plays a huge part on GMOs, and obviously that has a huge impact on having access to better quality food. You know, just because you don't agree with it, what about those people that can only afford to buy rice and not any other, you know, carbs or protein or those people need that rice to be as enriching and nutritious as possible.
Yeah.
So by you being like, no, GMO, you're taking away the chance for people to actually have improved food quality. So, and we're back around to, it's not just about you. You're not doing it for you. You're doing it for everybody.
It's the theme of many of our science podcasts.
Honestly, I just wish people would care about their communities more. So,
same.
Final bullet point before I open it up to you, if you have any other bullet points that you would like to add. The final bullet point is reduces burden on natural resources, water, soil, that kind of stuff. What
again
impact?
I can't see any downside to that. Like, that sounds like a very good thing.
Yeah, so, you know, not needing to irrigate as aggressively, not needing to import soils or that kind of stuff. Alternatively, if it can grow in any soil, you might just leave it in the soil and never rotate your crops, and that's also not a very sustainable way to farm. As you talked about before, there are ways that we did previously that allowed nutrients to be introduced into the soil and allowed pests and things to be discouraged from consuming the crops. If you can grow your crop in any soil, you may as well grow it in the most disgusting soil that you have and leave it there, because nothing else will grow there.
Yeah.
But that means that soil's never going to improve. It might mean that populations of animals in that area are severely impacted. So yeah, it's a good thing in general, but yeah, there are sort of smaller impacts that might need to be considered. So I'm going to turn it back around to you. Do you have any points that you would also like to add on the GMOs and their impact on the population and the planet?
So something that I've heard of, that I don't know very much about, I've just heard that it is a thing that can exist or that could happen, is the potential for a specific way of modifying something or a specific crop that has been modified to be, what's the word? Like patented. And
good one, yeah.
Or copyrighted in some way, right?
Yeah, it would be patented.
That, you know, someone can say, I found a way to make the most nutritious tomato and no one else can grow it because this was my invention. And then that would Well, first off, it would be an issue purely practically in terms of prices being extortionate because they can get away with it. But also, there's something weird and potentially unethical about being able to put a patent on like a natural thing, like just a type of plant. Like, how do you, or an animal or something, like how can you claim something like that as yours? You know, it's something I haven't heard discussed. Like I've heard it mentioned once or twice, but never a full discussion kind of mainstream.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a very ethical debate in terms of all things that we use in science to produce alternate genetically modified things. So obviously, yes, in the case of nutritious food, who are you to stop someone from being able to purchase nutritious food? If this superfood is so good, why can't it be accessible to everybody? But and the same thing is with medicines. You know, you patent vaccines, you patent treatments.
And that's something else that I just don't understand why that's allowed to happen.
Is obsessed with making money off of the sick, which is baffling. And I'm not saying you shouldn't be able to make money. I'm just saying, why are you making it so difficult for people to live? You know, that thing that people want to do, live. Why are you making it so difficult? So yeah, it's definitely a bigger ethical debate. But then it's also been extended into genetic modifications in terms of things like designer babies. When does the ability to remove a certain genetic mutation that would cause severe illness become, oh, and I'm also going to tweak this, and I'm also going to tweak this? Or when does it become too expensive to say, I would like to have children that don't have this life-threatening illness, but I have to pay several £1,000,000 for someone's patented method to help me achieve that? So yeah, it's completely woven throughout science, is that principle. And I think people don't want to face up to the fact that whatever science you do, there's going to be some patent implications, and you know, it's the same as I've said before, the sort of the way people protect their research is if someone's going to steal it. And it's like, nope, people just want to know and help and also develop their own ideas. And that isn't to say that there aren't people out there who are going to try and steal your ideas and take them as their own, but overall it's like less of an issue and more of a mental thing. So
especially if you've put your research out there first, we already know it was yours first because you've put it out there first. And with pre-internet, sure, it would be much easier for someone to claim it, but if you've uploaded it online, we know when you did it, we can prove it was you first.
Right. And I think the issues as well is in terms of teams of people working on things. And often in history, women have been written out of those discoveries because the lead investigator was a man. So it does, that thought of something belongs to you and you have to keep it for yourself and make money from it is very ingrained in the scientific community, I would say. Not everyone. We love people supporting people in my vein of science, but it does, it's true for a lot of science, that kind of who chooses what belongs to who and who decides what belongs to who and that kind of stuff. So overall, genetically modified organisms can help solve a lot of challenges. People need access to food and things, and they want to make it as easy as possible, especially in commercial agriculture, especially in non-commercial agriculture. And they are becoming more accepted. They're becoming necessary. We are millions of people are starving because we just can't produce enough food quick enough for all the populations. So it is something that people are considering more and more. You know, you can produce more food, you can produce better quality food, and you can do it all much more quickly. Seems great. Seems like a great idea. Because it will also help, it will help the businesses, it will help the people consuming the food and everybody in between a lot of times. But we can't shy away from the fact that we need to know more about it. We need to do more research on it. We need to change public perception. We need to aggregate all the things into one cohesive movement towards GMO. We can't like decide, oh, we're going to produce more GMO, because if you haven't changed people's perceptions, then it's not going to work. Or you can't change people's perceptions and then be like, actually, we've tried to do a bunch of GMO stuff and it doesn't work. And then people are demanding GMO because like, you promised us better food. So it is finding that balance and removing misinformation and removing this paper that I've quoted, it removing unethical research, because a lot of times people are messing with things that maybe they shouldn't be messing with. So yeah, do you have any closing questions? Or have I talked your ear off enough?
I think you have answered my questions. It was very comprehensive.
This was a very discussion-based episode, because I think it is important to talk about these pros and cons. You know, because we grew up together, but we still have different opinions on things. So it's always good to hear your take on a concept. So what is the next episode after this one? I think it might be our new series.
Oh, yes.
Would you like to introduce the series a little bit and talk about why it's a series?
So, Kim and I decided that we wanted to look at a long poem by a Northern Irish writer called Louis MacNeice. This is a poem called Autumn Journal. It is rather long and covers a quite wide variety of topics. So we decided to split it up into 4 episodes, each covering 6 cantos or sections of the poem. So we will be beginning with cantos 1 to 6 next time.
And do not fear, this will also be interspersed with related science. So,
yes.
So this series should take us up well into December, January, maybe?
Yes, it will finish in February.
Oh, that's a long time. So yeah, so we're going to have English, we're going to have science, but it's all going to be kind of related to the Autumn Journal and sort of the things that are spoken about in Autumn Journal and the themes in Autumn Journal, and how some of those themes can also be talked about in a scientific context. So
yes,
Autumn Journal is great, and I'll leave a little linky for people who want to read the Autumn Journal before we record or before we release the episode. And it's not necessary though for this one, because we kind of pick and choose bits that we want to talk about, so it's not necessary to read it. But if you want to, it's there, and there's some sort of annotations that Esmé's done, which are also useful and help you understand. Also bear in mind, there's some inflammatory language in the written version. So I will make sure that those words are censored and that there are warnings at the top to make sure you guys don't see anything you don't want to see, because we don't want to make anyone upset or frustrated or sad. So I think that's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you next time for our brand new series.
Cool, bye.